The morning sun barely crept through the Venetian blinds of the suburban ranch house in Phoenix, Arizona. It was March 1973, and the desert air carried the promise of another scorching day. Master David Chen stepped into his kitchen, the familiar weight of his black belt hanging loosely around his waist over his simple white GI. At 42 years old, his movements still carried the fluid precision that had made him a legend in American karate circles. The silence struck him immediately. By now, his wife Linda should have been preparing breakfast while their twin daughters, Sarah and Michelle, argued over who got the last of the Lucky Charms cereal. The house felt hollow, empty in a way that made his trained senses go on high alert. Chen had survived 2 tours in Vietnam before returning to establish his dojo in 1968, and he recognized the feeling of something being terribly wrong. He moved through the house with the controlled steps of a martial artist, checking each room methodically. The master bedroom showed no signs of struggle, but Linda's jewelry box sat open and empty. The girls' room looked as if they had left in a hurry, clothes scattered on the floor, beds unmade. Chen's jaw tightened as he noticed something that chilled him to the bone. 3 coffee cups sat unwashed in the sink, still bearing traces of lipstick and small fingerprints. Someone had been here with his family. In the living room, he found the first real clue. A business card lay on the coffee table, stark white against the brown shag carpet where it had apparently been dropped. Chen picked it up with steady hands, though his heart was racing. The card bore the logo of Desert Development Corporation, a name he recognized from the local newspapers. They were the company trying to buy up land throughout Phoenix for a massive shopping center project. Chen remembered the conversation he had had with their representatives just 2 weeks ago. They wanted to purchase the entire block where his dojo stood, offering what they called a generous sum. When he refused, explaining that the dojo was not just a business, but a community cornerstone where local kids learned discipline and respect, their smiles had turned cold. The lead negotiator, a thin man named Garrison, had made it clear that they always got what they wanted, one way or another. The phone rang, cutting through the morning silence like a blade. Chen answered on the second ring, his voice steady despite the storm building inside him. The voice on the other end was mechanically calm, disguised through what sounded like a handkerchief held over the receiver. The message was brief and terrifying. His family was safe for now, but their continued well-being depended entirely on his cooperation. He had 24 hours to sign the deed transfer papers that would be delivered to his dojo that afternoon. Chen set the phone down gently, but his hands were shaking with barely controlled rage. In the dojo, he had taught hundreds of students about discipline, about using martial arts only for defense and protection of others. He had preached patience, control, and finding peaceful solutions to conflicts. But as he stared at that business card, feeling the weight of his black belt around his waist, he realized that sometimes a man had to abandon those principles to protect what mattered most. He walked to his bedroom closet and opened a wooden box that had not been disturbed in 5 years. Inside lay his military dog tags, a Purple Heart, and a .45 caliber pistol he had carried through the jungles of Southeast Asia. Chen had hoped never to touch these items again, but Phoenix in 1973 was proving to be its own kind of war zone, where developers and businessmen fought with different weapons but no less brutality. The black belt around his waist suddenly felt like both a burden and a promise. Everything he had built in America, every student he had taught, every tournament he had won, all of it had led to this moment. Chen closed the box and walked to the window, looking out at the desert landscape that had become his home. Somewhere out there, Linda, Sarah, and Michelle were depending on him to do what he had trained his entire life to do: protect his family. By noon, Master David Chen would begin a hunt that would shake the foundations of Phoenix's business community and remind everyone why American karate had become a force to be respected and feared in equal measure. The Karate Dojo stood like a fortress against the sprawling Phoenix development boom of 1973, Chen's Dragon Spirit. Academy occupied a converted warehouse on Indian School Road, its plain concrete walls bearing no hint of the discipline and honor that flourished within. As Chen pulled his pickup truck into the gravel parking lot, he could see several of his afternoon students already waiting by the entrance, their white jizz crisp in the desert sun. 16-year-old Tommy Rodriguez was the first to approach, his brown belt tied with the precise knots Chen had taught him 2 years earlier. Behind him stood Maria Santos, one of the few female students in Phoenix's male-dominated martial arts scene, and Kevin Walsh, whose father owned the hardware store 3 blocks away. These kids represented everything Chen had built in America, a community where respect mattered more than money, where discipline could lift someone above their circumstances. "Sensei, you look different today," Maria observed, her dark eyes noting the tension in Chen's shoulders. At 19, she had been Chen's student longer than anyone else, having started training when most dojos still refused to accept women. Her intuition had always been sharp, a quality that had saved her from trouble in Phoenix's rapidly changing neighborhoods. Chen unlocked the heavy door and led them inside, where the familiar scent of sweat and worn leather filled the air. The dojo was simple but sacred. Polished wooden floors, mirrors along one wall, heavy bags hanging from reinforced beams, and a small shrine to honor the martial arts masters who had come before. On the wall hung photographs from tournaments across the Southwest, Chen's students proudly displaying their trophies and medals. As more students arrived for the afternoon session, Chen tried to maintain his normal teaching routine, but his mind kept drifting to the business card in his pocket and the deadline that hung over him like a sword. At precisely 3 o'clock, a black Cadillac Eldorado pulled into the parking lot, its chrome bumpers gleaming like predators' teeth. Through the large windows, Chen watched as 2 men in expensive suits emerged from the vehicle. The first man was tall and thin, with silver hair slicked back and cold blue eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they looked at. Chen recognized him immediately as Garrison, the lead negotiator from Desert Development Corporation. The second man was built like a linebacker, his suit barely containing shoulders that spoke of violence rather than boardroom meetings. "Continue practicing your kata forms," Chen instructed his students, his voice steady despite the storm building inside him. "Maria, lead them through the sequence we learned yesterday. I need to handle some business matters." He watched as his students bowed respectfully and began their practice, their synchronized movements a testament to years of patient instruction. Chen stepped outside to meet the visitors, closing the dojo door behind him to shield his students from whatever was about to unfold. Garrison approached with the confident smile of a man accustomed to getting his way, a manila envelope tucked under his arm like a weapon waiting to be deployed. "Mr. Chen, I trust you received our message this morning," Garrison said, his voice carrying the slight accent of someone who had learned to speak like money. "We're here to make this transition as smooth as possible for everyone involved. The paperwork is all prepared, requiring only your signature to finalize the transfer." The larger man remained silent, but his presence spoke volumes. Chen had seen enough hired muscle in Vietnam to recognize the type: professional, disciplined, and completely without conscience when it came to following orders. This was not some street thug, but a specialist. Someone who understood that fear could be more effective than actual violence. "Where is my family?" Chen asked quietly, his hands remaining loose at his sides, despite every instinct screaming for him to strike first. Years of martial arts training had taught him that the most dangerous moment in any confrontation was often the first few seconds, when emotions could override strategy. Garrison's smile never wavered. "They're perfectly safe, Mr. Chen. In fact, they're enjoying some unexpected hospitality at one of our development properties in the mountains. Beautiful views, clean air, very peaceful. They'll remain our guests until you demonstrate your willingness to be reasonable about this business arrangement." Through the dojo windows, Chen could see his students continuing their practice, unaware that their world was about to change forever. Maria was correcting Tommy's stance with the same patience Chen had shown her, passing on the traditions that connected them all to something larger than themselves. The sight filled him with both pride and desperate determination. "You have until 6 o'clock this evening," Garrison continued, sliding the envelope across the hood of Chen's truck. "Sign the papers and your family returns home safely tonight. Refuse, and we'll be forced to explore other options for acquiring this property. Phoenix is growing quickly, Mr. Chen. Sometimes people get lost in all that growth." As the Cadillac pulled away, leaving only dust and the lingering scent of expensive cologne, Chen stood alone in his parking lot holding papers that would destroy everything he had built. But behind him, through the walls of his dojo, he could hear the rhythmic sounds of his students practicing their techniques, preparing themselves to face whatever challenges life might bring. Chen smiled grimly and walked back inside, knowing that their real education was about to begin. The setting sun painted the Phoenix sky in shades of crimson and gold as Chen closed the dojo for what might be the last time. His students had gone home, unaware that their martial arts sanctuary hung in the balance. The unsigned papers from Desert Development Corporation lay on his desk like a death sentence, but Chen had made his decision hours ago. He would not surrender what he had built, and he would not abandon his family to the mercy of men who dealt in fear and violence. Chen drove his pickup truck through the rapidly expanding neighborhoods of North Phoenix, where new subdivisions sprouted from the desert floor like geometric mirages. The city was experiencing unprecedented growth in 1973, with developers and construction companies racing to transform empty land into shopping centers, apartment complexes, and housing developments. Money flowed like water through Phoenix's business community, and men like Garrison had learned to channel that flow to their advantage. His first stop was the Maricopa County Recorder's Office, where a friendly clerk named Mrs. Patterson had helped him navigate the property paperwork when he first purchased his dojo 5 years earlier. The building stayed open until 8 o'clock on weekdays to accommodate the construction boom, and Chen found Mrs. Patterson still at her desk, surrounded by stacks of deeds, permits, and development applications. "Mr. Chen, what brings you here so late?" she asked, looking up from her typewriter with genuine concern. Mrs. Patterson was in her 50s, a widow who had worked for the county since the 1950s, and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of Phoenix's land ownership records. Her graying hair was pinned back in a practical bun, and her sharp eyes missed nothing. "I need information about Desert Development Corporation," Chen said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "Property acquisitions, business partnerships, anything you might have in the public records." He had learned in Vietnam that intelligence was often more valuable than weapons, and Mrs. Patterson controlled access to some of the most important intelligence in Phoenix. Mrs. Patterson's expression grew troubled. "That company has been very busy lately, Mr. Chen, very aggressive in their acquisition strategy. They've purchased more than 30 properties in the past 6 months, most of them in your area of Indian School Road." She pulled out a thick folder marked with Desert Development's corporate seal. As Chen studied the documents, a pattern emerged that chilled him to the bone. Desert Development was not just buying random properties for development. They were systematically acquiring every building in a specific corridor that would be perfect for a massive shopping center project. His dojo sat directly in the center of their planned development, the final piece of a puzzle worth millions of dollars. "Mrs. Patterson, do these records show who owns Desert Development Corporation?" Chen asked, his martial artist's mind already working through the implications. In karate, understanding your opponent's true strength and weaknesses was essential for victory. She flipped through several pages before finding the incorporation documents. "The primary owner is listed as Vincent Garrison, but there are 3 silent partners whose names are sealed by corporate privacy laws. However," she lowered her voice and leaned closer, "I've seen those partners' names on other documents. One of them is Judge Harold Morrison, who handles most of the property dispute cases in Maricopa County. Another is Police Captain Robert Walsh." Chen's blood ran cold. Kevin Walsh, one of his most dedicated students, was Captain Walsh's son. The web of corruption extended directly into his dojo, threatening not just his family, but the children he had sworn to protect and teach. This was no longer just about real estate development. It was about a network of powerful men who believed they could take whatever they wanted. "There's something else, Mr. Chen," Mrs. Patterson whispered, glancing toward the door. 3 other property owners in your area have had family members go missing in the past month. The police reports were filed, but they all got transferred to Captain Walsh's desk and then quietly closed as resolved without any explanation. The families were told their relatives had simply left town voluntarily. Chen felt the familiar surge of controlled anger that had carried him through combat in Southeast Asia. These men were not just criminals. They were predators who used their positions of authority to prey on ordinary citizens. The beautiful desert city of Phoenix, with its promise of new beginnings and limitless opportunity, had become a hunting ground for those who confused money with morality. "Mrs. Patterson, I need one more favor," Chen said, his voice carrying the quiet intensity that his students recognized as a warning. "If anyone comes asking about my visit here tonight, please tell them I was researching property tax information for my business." "Nothing more," she nodded gravely. "Mr. Chen, be very careful. These men have resources and connections that go all the way to the state capital. They've been building their network for years, and they don't hesitate to eliminate obstacles." She handed him a business card for a private investigator named Jake Morrison, Judge Morrison's estranged brother, who had been quietly gathering evidence against the corruption network. As Chen drove away from the county building, the lights of Phoenix spread before him like a constellation of possibilities and dangers. Somewhere in those lights, Linda, Sarah, and Michelle were waiting for him to rescue them. But now he understood that this was bigger than just his family or his dojo. This was about whether Phoenix would become a city where justice mattered more than profit, where ordinary people could build dreams without fear of those who dealt in intimidation and violence. The black belt around his waist had never felt heavier, but Chen drove toward his next destination with the steady determination of a man who had finally found an enemy worthy of his full attention. The private investigator Jake Morrison lived in a modest ranch house in the foothills north of Phoenix, where the city lights gave way to the ancient silence of the Sonoran Desert. At 63 years old, Morrison had spent 30 years as a Phoenix police detective before his conscience forced him into early retirement. His weathered face bore the marks of a man who had seen too much corruption and refused to look the other way. Chen found Morrison sitting on his back porch at 10 o'clock that night, nursing a cup of black coffee and staring out at the desert landscape. The retired detective was not surprised by the visit. Mrs. Patterson had called ahead to warn him that someone might be coming with questions about his brother Judge Harold Morrison and the Desert Development Corporation. "You're the karate instructor," Morrison said without turning around, his voice carrying the gravelly tone of a man who had smoked too many cigarettes during long surveillance operations. "Your family's been missing since this morning. They're being held at a property about 40 miles north of here, in the McDowell Mountains." Chen felt his heart jump at the confirmation that his family was still alive, but his expression remained carefully controlled. Years of martial arts training had taught him that revealing emotion could be a weakness in dangerous situations, and this conversation would determine whether he gained an ally or walked into another trap. "How do you know where they are?" Chen asked, settling into a chair beside Morrison without being invited. The old detective's eyes were sharp despite his age, and Chen could see the intelligence that had made him one of Phoenix's most respected investigators before corruption drove him out of the department. Morrison reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small notebook filled with careful handwriting. "I've been tracking my brother's activities for 3 years, ever since I realized he was using his position on the bench to help certain developers acquire properties through questionable legal means. Desert Development Corporation is just the latest front company in a network that goes back to the late 1960s. The retired detective flipped through several pages before finding what he was looking for. "Your family is being held at a ranch property that Desert Development purchased 6 months ago, officially as a site for a future resort development. In reality, it's become a private prison where they keep people who refuse to cooperate with their land acquisition demands." Chen studied Morrison's weathered features, looking for any sign of deception. His martial arts training had sharpened his ability to read people, to detect the subtle physical tells that revealed dishonesty or hidden motives. But Morrison's posture and voice carried the steady confidence of a man telling the truth, even when that truth was dangerous. "There have been others?" Chen asked, though he already suspected the answer based on Mrs. Patterson's revelations at the county recorder's office. Morrison nodded grimly. 7 families in the past 18 months. The pattern is always the same. They identify a property they want, make an initial offer, and when that fails, family members start disappearing until the owner becomes more reasonable. Most people sign the papers within 48 hours. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and creosote bush through the darkness, reminding Chen of the vast emptiness that surrounded Phoenix's growing urban sprawl. In that emptiness, men like Garrison and his associates could operate with impunity, far from the eyes of honest law enforcement officers and concerned citizens. "Why haven't you gone to the authorities?" Chen asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Morrison's laugh was bitter and tired. "My brother controls the local court system, Captain Walsh runs the police department's property crimes division, and their third partner is City Councilman Robert Hayes, who oversees zoning approvals. They've built a perfect system where every level of government either helps them or looks the other way." Chen felt the familiar surge of controlled anger that had carried him through combat in Vietnam. These men had turned Phoenix's growth and prosperity into a weapon against ordinary citizens, perverting the very institutions that were supposed to protect people like his family. But anger without strategy was useless. and Chen needed information more than emotion. "Tell me about the ranch where they're holding my family," Chen said, his voice carrying the quiet intensity that his students recognized as complete focus. "Security, access routes, how many men they keep there." Morrison studied Chen's face for a long moment, perhaps recognizing something familiar in the martial artist's steady gaze. "You're planning to go after them yourself, aren't you?" "This isn't some Hollywood movie, Mr. Chen. These people have killed to protect their operation. 3 property owners who refused to cooperate have died in accidents over the past 2 years. Chen touched the black belt around his waist, feeling the weight of everything it represented. Years of discipline, thousands of hours of training, the responsibility to protect those who could not protect themselves. "Mr. Morrison, I spent 2 tours in Vietnam fighting people who believed that fear and violence could control entire populations. I came to Phoenix to build something better, to teach young people that there was a different way to resolve conflicts." The retired detective leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the distant lights of the city below. "And now?" "Now I'm going to remind these men that some people cannot be intimidated, no matter how much power they think they possess," Chen replied, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of a man who had already made his decision. "But I'm going to need your help to do it right." Morrison closed his notebook and stood up, moving with the careful precision of a man whose body bore the accumulated injuries of 3 decades in law enforcement. "Mr. Chen, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it smart. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. We get your family out safely, and then we make sure these bastards never hurt anyone else again." As the 2 men shook hands in the desert darkness, the lights of Phoenix spread before them like a battlefield, waiting for the dawn. The morning sun painted the McDowell Mountains in shades of gold and amber as Chen and Morrison crouched behind a cluster of desert sagebrush, studying the ranch compound through binoculars. The property sat in a natural bowl between 2 ridges, its main buildings arranged around a central courtyard that had once housed cattle but now served a much darker purpose. The ranch consisted of a main house built in the Spanish colonial style, popular among wealthy Phoenix developers, several outbuildings that appeared to be converted bunkhouses, and a large barn that showed signs of recent reinforcement. 2 black Cadillacs sat in the gravel driveway, their chrome bumpers reflecting the desert sunlight like warning signals. Chen counted at least 4 armed men patrolling the perimeter, their movements disciplined and professional. "Your family is being held in the main house, 2nd floor," Morrison whispered, pointing to a row of barred windows that faced the mountains. "There are usually 6 guards during the day, 3 more at night. They rotate shifts every 12 hours, and they're all ex-military. Probably Vietnam veterans like yourself, who couldn't find honest work when they came home." Chen felt a familiar cold anger settle over him as he recognized the tragedy Morrison had described. These men had served their country with honor, only to return to a society that offered them few opportunities beyond violence for hire. Desert Development Corporation and similar organizations had turned desperate veterans into instruments of their corruption, perverting the very skills that had once protected American freedom. "What about local law enforcement?" Chen asked, though he already suspected the answer based on everything Morrison had told him the night before. Morrison's expression was grim. "Captain Walsh has 3 patrol units that respond to calls in this area. They've been instructed to treat any disturbances at this property as domestic disputes that don't require police intervention. The fix is in at every level, from the sheriff's department to the county prosecutor's office." Chen studied the compound through his binoculars, his martial artist's mind automatically calculating angles of attack, defensive positions, and escape routes. But this was not a tournament where rules governed combat and referees ensured fair play. This was war, fought on terrain where money and corruption had replaced honor and justice as the governing principles. "Mr. Morrison, I need you to do something for me," Chen said quietly, never taking his eyes off the compound. "Drive back to Phoenix and contact every reporter, every federal law enforcement agency, every honest politician you can find. Tell them what's happening here. Give them copies of all your documentation about Desert Development Corporation." Morrison stared at him with alarm. "What are you planning to do?" Chen touched the black belt around his waist, feeling the weight of everything it represented. "I'm going to get my family back, and I'm going to make sure these men never hurt anyone else again. But I need you to ensure that the story survives, even if I don't." The retired detective grabbed Chen's arm with surprising strength, This isn't some movie, son. Those guards will kill you the moment you step onto that property. You can't fight 6 armed men with your bare hands. No matter how skilled you are, Chen smiled grimly, remembering lessons learned in the jungles of Southeast Asia, where survival often depended on creativity rather than firepower. Mr. Morrison, those men are expecting either a frightened property owner who will surrender without a fight, or a conventional assault by law enforcement officers who follow predictable procedures. They're not expecting someone who learned guerrilla warfare from the Viet Cong. As Morrison drove away to alert the authorities, Chen moved closer to the compound, using the natural terrain and vegetation to remain invisible to the guards. He had spent 2 hours the previous night preparing for this moment, gathering supplies from his dojo and remembering skills he had hoped never to use again. But Phoenix in 1973 had proven to be as much a battlefield as any jungle in Vietnam. At exactly noon, when the desert sun was at its most intense and the guards would be seeking shade, Chen struck with the sudden violence of a desert thunderstorm. The first guard never saw him coming, dropping unconscious from a precise strike to a nerve cluster that Chen had learned from a captured North Vietnamese instructor 20 years earlier. The second guard managed to reach for his weapon before Chen's hands found the pressure, points that would render him helpless without permanent damage. By the time the remaining guards realized they were under attack, Chen had already reached the main house and was moving through its rooms with the fluid precision of a martial artist who had found his true calling. Each confrontation lasted only seconds, ending with trained men lying unconscious on expensive carpets, their weapons scattered and useless. Chen found his family in the second-floor room Morrison had indicated, alive but frightened after 18 hours of captivity. Linda's eyes filled with tears of relief as she saw her husband standing in the doorway, still wearing his black belt and moving with the controlled grace that had first attracted her to him 15 years earlier. Sarah and Michelle ran to him with the absolute trust that only children could show, knowing that their father would always protect them from the monsters that hid in the world's shadows. 20 minutes later, as sirens wailed across the desert landscape and federal agents swarmed the compound, Vincent Garrison and his associates learned that some people could not be intimidated, no matter how much money or power they possessed. The network of corruption that had strangled Phoenix's honest growth was finally broken, not by politics or negotiation, but by a black belt karate instructor who understood that sometimes justice required more than words. As Chen embraced his family in the desert sunlight, his dojo and everything he had built in America was safe, protected not by legal documents or business agreements, but by the ancient principle that had guided martial artists for centuries. The strong must always protect the weak, regardless of the cost.